The early morning of February 23rd, 1945, on the rocky ridges above Iwo Jima, Private First Class Robert Bobby Hensley crouched behind the crumbling lip of a volcanic outcrop. The wind carried the acrid tang of cordite and scorched earth, mingling with the ever-present stench of sweat and unwashed bodies. Below him, the jagged line of Japanese soldiers began their familiar ritual Banzai charges, wave after wave, screaming their defiance into the smoke-choked air. But this time, Hensley and his fellow gunners had learned something new, something the textbook never mentioned. There was a precise point where the human tide could be stopped. A line, 50 yards from the American positions, beyond which the enemy's courage and training faltered against concentrated fire. For Hensley, this understanding had not come from doctrine but from survival. He remembered the first few encounters in the Pacific Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, where Marines had been, told to expect unrelenting, almost mythical resistance. The stories spun by Imperial Japanese propaganda and American intelligence briefings painted an enemy who would fight to the death without retreat. Yet repeated experience proved otherwise. The enemy's assaults could be predicted, their momentum measured, their collapse engineered. The shock was not in defeating the Banzai, but in the discovery that human psychology, when paired with firepower and logistics, obeyed patterns as predictable as the tide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By 1945, the Marine Corps had refined the art of defensive fire to a terrifying precision. Machine gunners were instructed to aim below Banzai charges, to fire not at the tallest figure in the wave or the nearest rifle barrel, but at the space where the enemy would collapse, under their own weight, where overextension and exhaustion made them vulnerable. These lessons were born of hard calculus, a combination of empirical observation and battlefield necessity. Gunnery manuals offered theoretical ranges, rates of fire, and tracer calculations, but the real teachers were the dead and the dying, whose bodies traced arcs across sand, rock, and coral. The world in which this tactic emerged was one defined by extremes. The Pacific War had stretched from the Aleutians to New Guinea, from the Philippines to the Marianas. American forces faced fortified islands, each defended by thousands of Japanese troops trained in rigid Bushido codes and drilled in the art of sacrifice. Japanese soldiers were conditioned to expect death rather than dishonor, yet even within this ethos lay human limitations. Exhaustion, thirst, and ammunition shortages were universal constraints. Marines learned to exploit these constraints systematically, turning the raw courage of the Banzai into predictable variables. Understanding this required a study not just of equipment but of environment and logistics. Machine guns, Browning M1917S, M1919S, and water-cooled Browning variants were mounted with painstaking attention to arcs of fire. Calculations accounted for elevation, wind, and sand resistance, and positions were reinforced to withstand counter-battery fire. Ammunition stocks were pre-positioned to ensure uninterrupted fire. Water and rations kept gunners operational beyond normal human endurance. Each emplacement was not merely a defensive position, but a laboratory in applied human physics, where observation and iteration dictated technique. The Japanese attacks, for all their intensity, followed discernible rhythms. Intelligence gathered from captured diaries, posthumous letters, and interrogation reports revealed patterns in timing, formation, and morale. Banzai charges typically accelerated in the early morning or late afternoon, when fatigue and hunger made the troops more predictable. When waves approached beyond the critical 50-yard mark, they maintained cohesion, crossed that line, and exhaustion compounded with confusion and the relentless application of concentrated fire to produce collapse. For the gunners, the lesson was clear. Mastery was not in brute force, but in calculated restraint, knowing when to unleash the fury and when to conserve strength, and always aiming below the peak of the enemy's advance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This calculus of combat was a revolution in applied battlefield psychology. It represented a profound irony. The so-called fanatical, relentless Banzai, once thought unstoppable, could be methodically neutralized not by superior courage or numbers, but by a disciplined understanding of human limitation and fire discipline. The Marines' training, harsh as it was, had instilled not just endurance but pattern recognition, situational awareness, and a capacity to calculate acceptable risk. Where the Japanese doctrine assumed irrational bravery, the Marines observed rational exhaustion. Where the enemy expected heroism to dominate outcomes, the gunners' empirical restraint dictated victory. The origin of this method can be traced back to earlier encounters in the Pacific. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines had first confronted densely packed Banzai formations across open sand. Casualty rates were staggering, yet through careful observation, officers began recording distances at which enemy waves broke, noting that sustained, aimed fire at precise ranges produced disproportionate effects. By Saipan and Tinian, these lessons were codified into manuals and field practice. By Iwo Jima, the theory had matured into doctrine, transforming defensive gunnery into a science of human collapse, a paradoxical interplay between lethality and restraint. Private Hensley's machine gun was ready, the barrel hot to the touch, the belts of ammunition coiled neatly beside him. He watched as the first wave rounded the ridge, screaming and brandishing rifles and bayonets. His finger hovered on the trigger. Below the charge, the line he had learned to trust the enemy began to falter. Bodies collided, momentum failed, and within moments the wave was a chaotic mass of retreat and confusion. The mathematics of combat, honed through years of trial and error, had delivered the expected outcome. No heroics, no improvisation, only the quiet, methodical application of knowledge, discipline, and firepower. In these moments, the central irony of the Pacific War became clear. Marines had trained for endurance, courage, and aggression. The Japanese had trained for honor, sacrifice, and obedience. Yet it was the disciplined application of empirical observation and calculated fire that won the day. The battlefield, in its most violent form, was governed not by ideology, but by physics, logistics, and human limitation. The Banzai, for all its terror, had predictable weaknesses, and those weaknesses could be exploited systematically. By the spring of 1945, the Marines' understanding of Banzai attacks was no longer theoretical. It had been tested repeatedly across the Central Pacific, in island after island where Japanese defenders clung to a doctrine of absolute aggression. Iwo Jima, however, presented a singular challenge. Unlike previous islands, the terrain was volcanic and jagged, riddled with tunnels, caves, and fortified ridges, leaving gunners few unobstructed lines of fire. For units like Hensley's, the ability to anticipate and exploit enemy behavior became essential, not merely advantageous. Corporal William Bill Dwyer, a machine gunner of the 3rd Marine Division, had spent weeks mapping the anticipated Japanese approach to his sector near Hill 382. Using captured aerial reconnaissance photographs and sketches provided by reconnaissance patrols, Dwyer and his squad measured the angles of slope, the positions of loose rocks, and the distance to the nearest ridgelines. They calculated that the Japanese would likely form their assault in 3 successive waves, each separated by roughly 40 to 60 seconds. Observing prior engagements, they noted that these waves generally began to lose cohesion around the 50-yard mark from defensive positions when fatigue, stress, and the weight of equipment caused gaps to appear in their formations. The gunners' calculations were precise. Machine guns were oriented slightly low, ensuring that bullets would intercept enemy legs and torsos rather than heads or shoulders. The decision to aim below the peak of the charge was not an act of callousness, but of tactical efficiency. A high trajectory risked overshooting, wasting ammunition, and allowing enemy momentum to carry through the line. Targeting below leveraged the natural collapse of human motion. A wave would destabilize, individuals would trip over one another, and panic would spread as soldiers fell under their own comrades. Reports from surviving Japanese defenders later confirmed this phenomenon, noting that entire sections of the assault collapsed before reaching the final line, hindered by their own formation and the devastating fire from below. Ammunition logistics were critical to sustaining this tactic. At Iwo Jima, water-cooled Browning M1917 machine guns were fed by belts weighing up to 25 pounds, and gunners were rotated carefully to prevent exhaustion. Each emplacement was stocked with at least 25 belts per gun, sufficient to maintain uninterrupted fire for nearly an hour of continuous engagement. Ammunition points were concealed behind coral outcrops and ridges, allowing resupply under fire. Water and field rations were positioned within 20 yards of gun crews, permitting gunners to remain at their posts far longer than any single wave could survive. In contrast, Japanese troops carried only minimal rations and ammunition, a factor that compounded the effects of exhaustion as waves advanced. The human dimension of the engagement was perhaps most striking. Japanese Banzai doctrine emphasized psychological momentum, the belief that overwhelming bravery could break defensive lines. Officers instructed men to shout, scream, and maintain cohesion at all costs. Yet repeated exposure to disciplined, precise fire eroded that cohesion. The first wave might reach within 70 yards before sustaining casualties, but by the 50-yard mark, panic spread quickly. Individual soldiers faltered, tripped, or dropped weapons. Observers like Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding Japanese defences at Peleliu and later at Iwo Jima, recorded that units often lost between 20 and 30% of their effective strength before reaching the Americans' primary firing line. When waves collapsed prematurely, subsequent waves were delayed, creating a cascading effect that the Marines exploited ruthlessly. This interplay between human physiology and gunnery discipline was documented meticulously in post-action reports. On March 1, 1945, after a series of engagements near the Motoyama airfield complex, Captain James McAllister of the 3rd Marine Division wrote, "Enemy charges, though frequent and spirited, collapse predictably when engaged at the lower range of 50 yards. Maintaining fire at torso and lower extremities maximizes effect, while conserving ammunition and minimizing risk to gunners." The phrasing of this report, clinical in tone, reflected the systematic nature of the strategy. It was not improvisation or luck that enabled Marines to stop waves. It was calculation, observation, and iterative refinement. Even equipment design played a decisive role. The Browning M1917, water-cooled and capable of sustained fire far beyond what a soldier could deliver with a rifle, allowed gunners to maintain concentrated volleys at precisely the ranges that had been determined to be most effective. Tracer ammunition provided both orientation and visual feedback, revealing gaps in enemy formations and enabling rapid correction. Field modifications, sandbags to stabilize tripods, small adjustments to barrel height ensured that rounds consistently struck the optimal target area. Combined with overlapping fields of fire from adjacent positions, these measures transformed a single defensive line into an almost impervious network of lethal zones. Human psychology remained central. Surviving Japanese troops later testified to the disorienting effect of seeing multiple waves falter under concentrated fire. Private Tadashi Ogawa, captured on Iwo Jima, recalled, "We had been trained to never stop, to charge until we fell, but every time we approached the Americans, half of our men fell before reaching their line. Others hesitated, confused. The fear spread like fire, and we could not recover." Similar accounts from other prisoners and post-war diaries corroborated the observation that collapse often originated not from direct hits alone, but from compounded confusion and mutual interference. The Marines had learned to exploit this natural human tendency, turning the enemy's training against them. The climactic moment of this method was starkly evident during a massive assault on Hill 362 on March 10, 1945. Nearly 400 Japanese soldiers launched a coordinated Banzai attack against the positions held by elements of the 5th Marine Division. As they advanced from the base of the ridge, gunners like Hensley focused fire at the 50-yard threshold. Within moments, the leading soldiers fell, tripped over one another, and the line became a chaotic, compressed mass. Continuous fire prevented any reorganization. Marine observers estimated that within 60 seconds, nearly 30% of the attacking force was neutralized before reaching the primary trench line. Subsequent waves encountered the same fate, and the ridge was secured with minimal further casualties. Such efficiency was the product of iterative learning, not innate genius. At Saipan, machine gunners first discovered that aiming at the center of the mass caused over-penetration and wasted rounds. At Tinian, they learned that too high a trajectory allowed enemy momentum to carry troops past defensive lines. Iwo Jima was the culmination of years of empirical study, where observation, repetition, and precise coordination between units yielded results that textbooks could not fully anticipate. In essence, the Marines had quantified chaos and imposed order through disciplined application of firepower. The irony of this success was not lost on officers and enlisted men alike. The Japanese soldiers, trained to embody absolute bravery and sacrifice, were systematically defeated not by superior numbers or brute force, but by the application of controlled, calculated science. Courage, when removed from coordination and physiological limitation, became a predictable variable. Heroism, when observed methodically, could be countered with disciplined calculation. This paradox mirrored earlier insights gained with the M1 Garand and other innovations. Raw capability mattered less than reliability, observation, and the strategic application of available tools. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological ramifications were profound. Marines gained confidence and composure, knowing precisely how to engage waves and what to expect from enemy behavior. Japanese forces, by contrast, experienced repeated demoralizing failures that contradicted their indoctrination. The repetition of collapse at predictable ranges eroded morale far more efficiently than sporadic casualties or artillery bombardment ever could. By turning Banzai charges into predictable events, the Marines redefined the dynamics of defensive combat in the Pacific, creating a model of lethal efficiency rooted in human observation and tactical discipline rather than mythic heroism. Even at the individual level, gunners internalized these lessons through repeated experience. Hensley, by the end of the third week of the Iwo Jima campaign, could anticipate the approach of an enemy wave before it crested the ridge. He knew which sectors required concentrated bursts, which could be left momentarily dormant, and how to coordinate with adjacent emplacements to create crossfire that maximized collapse. This form of anticipatory combat reflected not just training, but an intimate, human-centered understanding of how exhaustion, fear, and physical limitations interacted under stress. The aftermath of Iwo Jima left a complex legacy, both for the men who had executed the defensive fire discipline and for the Japanese forces who had learned, too late, the limits of unrelenting courage. Private Hensley, like countless other gunners, remained on post long after the last Banzai wave had collapsed. His arms ached from prolonged firing, sweat streaked his soot-covered face, and yet he felt a measured calm, the product of repeated exposure to the rhythm of attack. He had learned not only how to wield a machine gun, but also how to anticipate human behavior under extreme duress. Every wave, every fallen soldier, every scream of defiance had contributed to a calculus of combat, a system of prediction and control that reduced chaos to measurable outcomes. Japanese survivors painted a contrasting picture. Captain Yoshio Kobayashi, who commanded a company at the base of Motoyama, later testified during post-war interviews that his men had approached Iwo Jima with the expectation of achieving honor through sacrifice. They believed that relentless aggression, coordinated with comrades, would overwhelm American positions. What they encountered instead was a rigorously applied science of attrition. Entire companies broke apart, not solely because of superior firepower, but because their human limitations had been anticipated and exploited. In the words of Kobayashi, "We were trained to fight without fear, but the Americans fought with calculation. Their discipline turned our courage into disorder." The psychological dimension extended beyond immediate combat outcomes. The repetition of failed assaults created a demoralizing effect far greater than any single casualty report could convey. Marines observed that Japanese soldiers who survived the first or second wave often hesitated or faltered during subsequent attacks, a human reaction to repeated trauma compounded by the knowledge that their advance would almost certainly result in death before reaching the American lines. In essence, the Marines had weaponized expectation. By aiming below the wave, controlling ranges, and maintaining steady fire, they created a feedback loop in which Japanese forces became progressively less effective, even as their numbers remained constant. This method was codified post-war in Marine Corps manuals, not as a tale of heroism, but as a study in applied battlefield psychology and empirical tactics. Training regimens for subsequent gunners emphasized not merely marksmanship but observation, pattern recognition, and the calculation of human limits under stress. Ammunition discipline, positional awareness, and anticipatory firing became as critical as technical skill with the machine gun itself. Lessons learned on Iwo Jima informed training for the Korean War and later conflicts, demonstrating the enduring value of understanding the human variables in combat as much as the technological ones. The material reality of the battlefield reinforced the method's success. Japanese supply constraints meant that waves were often underfed, underarmed, and physically exhausted before reaching the 50-yard threshold. Rations of rice and canned goods were minimal, and ammunition was carried in limited quantities, often sufficient for only 1 or 2 coordinated assaults. When compounded by fatigue from marching across volcanic ash and coral rubble, the efficiency of the Banzai charge diminished rapidly. American logistics, by contrast, were robust and nearly limitless. Water, rations, medical supplies, and replacement ammunition flowed to frontline positions daily. The combination of disciplined gunnery and superior logistics created a structural advantage that rendered Japanese bravery insufficient to overcome the material imbalance. The human-centered insight gained through these engagements also highlighted the irony of the Pacific Campaign. Japanese military doctrine prized honor, courage, and the spiritual superiority of sacrifice, yet it systematically ignored the empirical realities of combat fatigue, physiological limits, and the effects of concentrated fire. The Marines, by contrast, focused relentlessly on reliability, observation, and iterative improvement. They measured outcomes, recorded data, and adjusted tactics accordingly. The ability to stop waves at 50 yards was less a miracle than a natural consequence of disciplined study and attention to detail. Heroism was unnecessary. Calculation and endurance were sufficient. First-hand accounts reinforce this point. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto, a Japanese survivor from the Motoyama sector, later wrote in a post-war diary, "We charged as we had been taught, with cries and bayonets, believing the Americans would falter before us. But at 50 yards, we fell, not from fear of bullets alone, but because our formations failed. Each man stumbled into the next, panic spread, and our courage became useless. We had been trained to die, yet we died in disorder." These reflections provide rare insight into how empirical observation can outmatch ideology in combat. The legacy of these methods extends into broader historical analysis of the Pacific War. The seemingly small tactical innovation aiming below the Banzai and exploiting the 50-yard collapse demonstrates a recurring theme in military history. Human behavior, when carefully observed and anticipated, can be leveraged as decisively as any weapon. It underscores the notion that technological advantage alone does not determine battlefield outcomes. Psychological insight, logistical preparation, and disciplined execution often matter more. In the immediate post-battle months, these lessons influenced how Marine Corps leadership evaluated offensive and defensive doctrine. General Holland Smith, reflecting on Iwo Jima and previous engagements, emphasized the importance of empirical observation of enemy behavior. Training manuals began to incorporate explicit guidance on range-specific engagement, coordinated fields of fire, and the careful measurement of human limitations. The doctrine of anticipatory fire, born in the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, became a foundational principle of small unit defensive strategy in the decades to follow. At the human level, the method shaped the experience of countless Marines. Bobby Hensley, upon his return to the United States, reflected on the paradox of his wartime service, that the most effective moments in combat were not those of personal heroism or daring, but those in which discipline, observation, and calculation intersected. By understanding the limits of the enemy, he and his comrades transformed chaos into predictable outcomes. The visceral terror of Banzai attacks was neutralized not through emotion, but through structured application of knowledge. The irony extends beyond individual experience. Japanese soldiers were lauded by their own military culture for valor and self-sacrifice, yet these qualities, when isolated from situational awareness, logistics, and empirical study, proved insufficient against an enemy who applied discipline and observation systematically. The 50-yard collapse line, a seemingly small tactical detail, encapsulated a profound truth about warfare. Bravery alone cannot substitute for preparation, analysis, and adaptation. In a broader sense, the method exemplifies the psychological interplay of attrition and perception in combat. Marines calculated not only the physical outcomes of their fire, but also the expected morale effects. Repeated failures of Banzai waves created a demoralizing effect that amplified the material superiority of American arms. Japanese officers quickly recognized that, no matter how heroic the charge, the outcome was increasingly predetermined by the disciplined application of firepower combined with logistical superiority. By integrating observation, calculation, and restraint, the Marines imposed a form of inevitability on engagements that had previously been thought chaotic and unpredictable. Ultimately, the story of firing below Banzai charges is more than a tale of battlefield success. It is a reflection on the nature of combat itself. It illustrates how observation, calculation, and human understanding can transform lethal chaos into predictable outcomes. It highlights the irony that the enemy, trained to embody relentless courage and honor, was undone not by inferior bravery, but by the disciplined application of knowledge and experience. It demonstrates that the most effective tactics are not necessarily the most spectacular or dramatic, but the ones that reconcile human behavior, material reality, and precise execution. As Hensley and his comrades moved off the ridge at the conclusion of the campaign, the volcanic terrain littered with the remnants of failed charges, the lesson was clear. War is not a test of mythical courage, but a complex interplay of physics, psychology, and preparation. In that crucible, the disciplined, patient, and empirically informed gunners of the Marine Corps had redefined the parameters of defensive combat in the Pacific. They had discovered the critical threshold, the 50-yard line, where valor met, in human limitation, and they had learned how to control it. And in that lesson lies the enduring paradox of the Pacific War, that in a conflict defined by fanatical courage and sacrifice, it was calm observation, calculation, and the rigorous application of human knowledge that decided the fate of men and the outcome of battles. The smoke of battle had long since cleared from Iwo Jima, yet the lessons it imparted lingered in the minds of those who survived. For Private First Class Robert Hensley, the volcanic ridges, scorched coral, and shattered emplacements remained vivid, not merely as memories of fire and carnage, but as a crucible in which understanding, observation, and human psychology had been tested and refined. He often recalled the 50-yard line not as a mere point on a map, but as a symbol of the intersection between human limitation and disciplined application of force. In the months and years that followed, he realized that what had occurred on those ridges transcended the tactical. It was a revelation about the nature of war itself. Hensley's reflections were not unique. Across the Pacific, countless gunners, riflemen, and officers came to understand that the Banzai charges, once mythologized as unstoppable demonstrations of fanatical courage, could be studied, measured, and mitigated through disciplined observation. The Marine Corps had, over years of brutal combat, learned to predict human behavior in conditions of extreme stress. Physiological exhaustion, the compounding effects of heat, lack of hydration, and heavy equipment, all factors long ignored in theoretical manuals, had been integrated into tactical doctrine. By aiming below the advancing waves, Marines had transformed a seemingly chaotic assault into an event governed by empirical rules. This understanding marked a profound shift in the philosophy of combat. The Japanese doctrine of absolute courage and honor had assumed that morale alone could sustain an assault to its completion. Banzai tactics, while visually and emotionally striking, were inherently dependent on continuous momentum and unbroken formation. Once that formation faltered, the charge became vulnerable to collapse under its own weight. The Marines had recognized this vulnerability early, and by aligning their fire with the natural breaking points of human cohesion, they imposed predictability on a process previously thought uncontrollable. Captain James McAllister, who oversaw gunnery positions near Motoyama, later recounted in post-war debriefings how the refinement of these methods had become almost scientific. Observing waves in motion, noting where soldiers faltered, and recording the effectiveness of fire allowed him to iteratively improve techniques with each engagement. It was a systematic process. Identify the point at which cohesion failed, position fire to exploit this, and ensure overlapping fields of fire so that no wave could penetrate. This method was not a product of luck, heroism, or intuition. It was a deliberate, calculated application of knowledge. The psychological consequences were equally profound. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to embrace death over retreat, found their courage rendered ineffective by what they initially perceived as mere chance. Over successive engagements, the predictability of collapse induced fear, hesitation, and confusion, even before bullets struck. Private Tadashi Ogawa, who survived several assaults, later wrote, "We charged with every intention of reaching them, yet every time we neared 50 yards, disorder overcame us. Our courage became irrelevant. The Americans were not faster or stronger. They were patient, calculating, and unyielding." His observations, corroborated by multiple post-war accounts, underscored the interplay between human physiology, morale, and disciplined fire. The 50-yard principle, while tactical in nature, became a broader metaphor for the intersection of human limitation and strategic foresight. Marines were trained to endure, to anticipate, and to act with precision under extreme stress. The Japanese emphasis on ritualistic bravery, while culturally and psychologically powerful, failed when confronted with sustained empirical observation and methodical exploitation of human constraints. The result was a form of asymmetrical psychological advantage. The enemy's strengths became liabilities when systematically engaged by forces who understood their own limits and those of their opponents. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the implications extended into post-war military thought. Marine Corps manuals incorporated lessons learned from Iwo Jima and preceding campaigns, emphasizing the importance of anticipating enemy behavior rather than relying solely on firepower or fortifications. Small unit tactics began to integrate human factors, stress analysis, and logistical considerations into standard practice. The 50-yard line became more than a tactical observation. It evolved into a conceptual framework for understanding combat dynamics, illustrating that empirical knowledge and disciplined execution often outweigh brute force or inherited ideology. Material and logistical considerations were inseparable from this tactical evolution. Machine guns, particularly the Browning M 1917 water-cooled variants, were central to the method's success. Their ability to sustain fire for extended periods without overheating allowed gunners to maintain lethal zones of fire with minimal interruption. Ammunition management was critical. Belts were pre-positioned, and supply lines ensured that gunners could operate beyond normal human endurance. Water, rations, and rest rotations were calculated with precision, reflecting the understanding that human performance, not merely equipment, dictated outcomes. Even in broader strategic terms, the method demonstrated the limits of dogmatic bravery. Japanese commanders, faced with repeated failures at predictable ranges, began to adjust tactics, often too little and too late. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, reflecting on Peleliu and later Iwo Jima, noted that while courage could inspire troops, it could not compensate for exhaustion, lack of ammunition, or the predictable application of disciplined fire by an observant opponent. The Marines had effectively turned the most celebrated aspect of Japanese martial culture, devotion to honor and fearless advance, into a quantifiable vulnerability. The enduring significance of these lessons is evident in how they influenced subsequent conflicts. Korean War engagements, particularly defensive operations in mountainous terrain, incorporated the principle of range-based anticipation, observing human limitations under stress, structuring fields of fire to exploit fatigue and confusion, and integrating logistical support to maintain operational endurance became standard practice. Even in modern doctrine, the essential insight remains. Understanding human behavior under duress is as crucial as technological superiority. On a personal level, Hensley and his fellow gunners internalized a complex psychological truth. Heroism and courage, while culturally valorized, were subordinate to disciplined observation, calculation, and execution. In letters home, veterans described the 50-yard line not as a mere tactical benchmark, but as a lived principle, a threshold where human endurance, fear, and expectation intersected predictably with disciplined action. It was a quiet, almost clinical insight into the nature of combat, that survival and success often depended not on bravado, but on knowledge applied with precision. The contrast with Japanese experience was stark. Soldiers trained to embrace death over hesitation found themselves repeatedly neutralized, not through failure of spirit, but through empirical anticipation of human limitations. Entire companies were disrupted by collapse induced not by superior firepower alone, but by methodically applied, patient, and disciplined fire. The paradox was profound. In a conflict defined by courage and sacrifice, the predictable, measured application of knowledge proved decisive. In the end, the 50-yard line symbolizes more than a technical detail. It embodies a philosophy of warfare grounded in observation, human understanding, and disciplined execution. Marines learn to read human behavior as carefully as they read maps, to anticipate collapse as they would predict tides or wind, and to act with calculated efficiency in the crucible of combat. The Banzai charges, once terrifying and mythologized, became instruments for teaching the limits of courage when confronted with structured, patient application of lethal force. As the Pacific War drew to a close, the implications of these lessons persisted. Marines returned home carrying not just memories of battle, but an understanding that human performance, when combined with observation, discipline, and logistical foresight, could decisively shape outcomes. For historians, the 50-yard line remains a microcosm of the Pacific Campaign, a small, tactical innovation that illuminated fundamental truths about warfare, psychology, and the interplay between human courage and methodical calculation. In reflection, the ultimate lesson of the 50-yard line is a meditation on the limits of valor. Courage alone does not dictate the course of battle. Endurance, observation, and disciplined execution often matter more. The Marines' methodical, empirical approach transformed chaos into predictability, turning legendary bravery into a quantifiable variable that could be neutralized. Through this, the Pacific War reveals its most enduring paradox. In a theater defined by sacrifice, death, and unyielding courage, it was calculation, discipline, and understanding of the human condition that determined victory. And so, the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, scarred and silent, continue to speak a quiet truth. For those who fought, the 50-yard line was more than a measure of distance. It was a revelation about the nature of combat, the intersection of human limitation and disciplined action, and the enduring lesson that observation, preparation, and empirical understanding often outweigh the most heroic of intentions. The Marines had learned it through fire, sweat, and discipline. The Japanese discovered it through repeated failure and tragic calculation. In that crucible, the human element, the mind, the body, the limits, and the anticipation became the decisive weapon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.